Hey there, fellow narrow gaugers. In today's video, I want to talk a little bit about some of the other stuff that we have around here. This facility is officially known as the Youngstown Steel Heritage Museum, and we got started about 20 years ago to preserve some of the steel industry equipment from the Youngstown area. And it all started with this giant machine right here. This is what we call the Todd engine. The Todd engine is a 4,000 horsepower cross compound rolling mill steam engine that was used at a steel mill about 5 miles west of here. And it was built in 1913 and operated until 1979. Now, before you had high horsepower electric motors to drive rolling mills, you'd have giant steam engines like this. And this engine weighs about 260 tons and pretty much fills our entire main building. The engine would run at 75 RPM, flywheels 20 foot in diameter, and would transmit power through each end of the crankshaft in drive shafts that would go out to the 6-stand rolling mill. We acquired the engine in 1995. The organization got started in 92. Now, I graduated high school in 92, so this was our first big project. So it's something that I've been working on for over half my life, building this museum. The initial project was to dismantle this engine and move it from Briar Hill, from the Briar Hill Works. Bought this property and then over a period of years moved it here. And then started reassembling it and finally got it back together in 2007. And in 2009, we were able to build our building. And in our building, we also have this overhead crane that was built by Morgan Engineering in 1893, which makes it probably one of the oldest, if not the oldest, electric overhead traveling cranes in the United States. But the only thing that survives from 1893 are the two girders and the two end trucks. Everything else has been pretty much changed over the years, including the trolley. But we got this also in 2009 when we put the building up, so we had the building constructed for the overhead crane. It last ran in 2009, and we've not yet had the opportunity to get up and make it run here, although as you can tell, because the engine takes up most of the building, there wouldn't be much for this crane to do in here. Now, to tell you a little bit about how this engine works, you see the large valve there on top of the high pressure cylinder. 150 pounds, 150 psi steam would come in through a 12-inch line from the boiler house. And this had dual piston valves, meaning you had one piston valve for the intake and one for the exhaust, and then a 34-inch diameter cylinder and a 5-foot stroke. And so that once the steam would exhaust out of that cylinder, it would go under the floor and up into this cylinder, which was the low pressure side, which was 68-inch in diameter, also 5-foot stroke. But this side has coreless valve gear. And as we get up on top of the engine, and you can see all the other miscellaneous effluvia we've got around here. In the off season, the place is a workshop, so it's kind of a mess. As I pan around, we did a cosmetic restoration on the engine in 2014 for its 100th anniversary. And we got most of it done, but kind of ran out of time, so we didn't get this low pressure bed plate done. And that all eventually will happen. But it was also in end of 2014, beginning of 2015 when we started on the narrow gauge project, and that's kind of taken a lot of our efforts since then. And the reason for that being that, hey, as great as this thing is, I mean, how many people are you going to really attract to come here to see a giant steam engine? Motorheads and people are interested in mechanical things will come, but the general public won't. The general public will pay the bills. general public and the kids like trains. So you build the train's the attraction. You get them in, they come in, they can also see some of this other neat stuff we have here. So that's kind of the strategy of the museum. Okay, as we come outside on the north side of the building, of course, here is the little payloader that was the star of the last video. And what's interesting about this machine is that it came from the Norfolk and Western Railway, so it is a piece of actual railroad equipment. And we're probably going to do some work on it and repaint it and keep it around here to do basically what it was doing in the last video, moving ballast and aggregates. So we have some standard gauge railroad equipment here as well. The big silver freight car is called a cling type hot metal car, and it was built in Youngstown, and it was used for hauling molten iron from the blast furnaces in a steel mill to the open hearth steelmaking furnaces. This car would have a 75-ton capacity, meaning it carries 75 tons of molten iron inside, and was built here in Youngstown by the William B. Pollock Company and used in the Pittsburgh area, assigned to either Carey furnaces or the Duquesne Works or Edgar Thomson, one of the U.S. Steel facilities down there in Pittsburgh. We acquired it a few years ago and brought it up here, bringing it back home to the city where it was built. The diesel locomotive is a 70-ton GE center cab built in 1942 for the New York Central. And it's kind of an unusual locomotive in that I think the War Production Board had a heavy hand in the creation of, I think, 6 or 7 of these, because they were built not for switching freight cars, but mainly for switching passenger cars in passenger terminals. So you could see they were built with diaphragm buffers on them to protect diaphragms on passenger cars as they were being switched. The locomotives turned out to be very underpowered and slow and didn't really fit with anything else the New York Central had. So by 1953, they had pretty much gotten rid of all these locomotives, and 2 of them came up here to our area, went to Shenango Slag Company in Sharpsville, and then went to Standard Slag in Youngstown, and then they were sold to George Silcott, locomotive rebuilder, and then went to Valley Mold and Hubbard. And I worked for the successor to Valley Mold for about 2 years, and one of my jobs was operating the locomotive. So I ran this thing in around 1999, 2000, and then 7 years later it was donated to us and came here. And here, sitting here, is these are the connecting rods for the Todd engine. They're not, of course, not installed yet because we haven't got that far to put the rods back in, so they are sitting here waiting to go in. This is 22-inch diameter crank pins on that engine. Kind of give you an idea of just how big of a steam engine that thing is. And another piece that came out of a steel mill. This was a home-built portable winch that you'd hook up to the 250 volt DC lines, and you can, lash it to a building column or something and tug on whatever you had to tug on. I just thought it was an interesting piece to save, so we brought it up here. And then over here is one of the Baldwin-built ore shunt locomotives that was used at the Whiskey Island ore docks in Cleveland. Most of the ore facilities that unloaded the ships of iron ore that had Hewlett unloaders would have little locomotives like this that would be used for pushing the ore jennies around for loading, because it's very difficult to load in the middle of a track a bunch of hopper cars and you're back in the locomotive shoving the cars. You can't really see what's going on if you're back around the bend. So they came up with these where you just push against the corner of the car with this arm that flops down. And so you could be sitting right here in the cab looking right up at the loader and know exactly what's going on. So that was kind of the purpose for these. They're rather unusual. 42.5-inch track gauge. They had inside third and fourth rail for electric pickups. Ran on 250 volt DC. And hanging off the side of the cab is one of the electrical pickup shoes, and that would fit down in that that bracket there and ride on the two rails. There's not too much in the cabinet here. There's the electro-pneumatic switchgear, the reversers in here, the various contactors are in there, the air compressor and the air tanks up front, and then there's two traction motors, and that's pretty much all that's in this thing. But it was built in 1912, about the same time, well, 2 months after the Titanic sank, so it's about the same era of technology. Out front of the engine house, one of our narrow gauge cars here is a recreation of an open hearth charging car. These individual scrap boxes would be picked up and then thrust inside of an open hearth furnace, spun around, dropping the scrap load out, and then pulled back out, set on the car. And then the narrow gauge would bring the cars in, and then the charging machine would just continue to unload it until you got the open hearth furnace full of scrap. So one of the two functions that the 58 and its sisters had at J&L was moving these scrap boxes to the open hearth furnaces, and the other function was moving the ingots and ingot molds around. So the locomotives pretty much worked in the open hearth department. We bought one of the Carpenter cars. It was large enough we could put 3 boxes on. We have another 3 boxes that's going to be coming in here, so we can have at least 2 of these cars together. And we've been filling them up with our own bits and pieces of scrap, with the intention of having 2 fully loaded cars to put behind the 58 for some of our operating sessions when we want to give the locomotive a bit of a load going up the new hill. So that's what we got going on there. There's also plans to eventually acquire ingot molds and put a couple cars together, so we have a little ingot mold train. Ingot molds are hard to come by anymore because they're especially made for the mills. There's not very many of them out there that are available in our size, so we may have to have them made new from scratch. Fortunately, the company here in Hubbard that I worked for, that locomotive was at, is an ingot mold foundry, so we may be able to work a deal with them. I've got some other components here. There's the oil cooler for the SDP 45. There's a extra set of drivers for 58. Here's a couple of scrap mill rolls from McDonald Steel, which is another steel mill just north of Youngstown. We're also planning on making a car for the narrow gauge that will be in a mill roll carrying car. It was also something you would have seen in the mills, and so we'll have those sitting on one of these Carpenter cars eventually. And the two hoppers, which we are borrowing from the Bucks Cahuta and Western, which is another it's a privately owned 2-foot gauge railroad out in St. Mary's, PA. So they very graciously let us use their cars here for ballast cars. And let's see what else we got around here. Of course, we have the Big Heister, which, thanks to the generosity of Ted Best, donated this machine to us last year, and it's been a godsend. This is the best thing to have around here when you're dealing with a lot of heavy equipment that needs to be moved. And finally here, we've got this small Denelli rolling mill stand that was donated several years ago. And it's here to show basically how a rolling mill works. Eventually we'll get that installed somewhere so that it'll become an interpretive piece. We have this crane hook that came off of a 100-ton Shaw crane that they were scrapping the overhead crane, so we got the hook off of it. And then underneath it, we have an even larger hook, which is a ladle hook that goes on a steel ladle. And that hook weighs about 12,000 pounds and is made up of 7 1-inch steel plates that are all riveted together. And then we've got a couple more pieces off the Todd engine, eccentric rods that need to go back on. So basically that's just a quick overview of some of the other interesting stuff we have here at Youngstown Steel Heritage. As time goes on, some of these pieces will eventually be put on exhibit and used, or put back in the machines that they go on, and it all in due course. So it sounds like the neighbors across the street are running a dozer today. Always got some interesting things going on in this neighborhood. So I'm going to get back to work here on the track, and I'll talk with you later.